Hi everybody, in this video we are going to create a Next.js application with Postgres database using NextAuth. We're going to have full CRUD capabilities, real-time, validation, authentication, authorization, and eventually even deployment to both Railway and Vercel. And we're going to cover a lot of ground. It's going to be a bit long video, but hopefully you'll find it useful. You'll learn a lot about Next, Remalt, NextAuth, messaging, and whatever. So let's get started. And the first thing I'm going to do is I would like to go and create a next project. So I'm going to go over here and I'm going to say npx create next app latest. And I'm going to name it whatever. And I'm going to use TypeScript, no ESLint, no Tailwind, yes source, yes app router, and no import alias. Now Next will install everything that it needs. And we can enter our new directory and open VS Code. Now that I've opened VS Code, I'd like to configure the tsconfig file to support experimental decorators. Later we're going to use that. We can see here the standard Next app files. And let's go ahead and fire up Next and see what we get. Let's open the URL. Localhost 3000, and we get the default Next UI. So we're going to write a CRUD application based around the good old to-do example. So the first thing I want to do is create a to-do component. So I'm going to, under source, going to create a components, and in it I'm going to create a task.ts or to-do tsx. Export default function to do, and it's going to return a div and in it an h1 with to dos. Now I want to create a rich front-end application, so I'm going to make this a use client component. In a different video we'll discuss SSR and its capabilities, and I'll head over to the page, which is what we see on the right, and I'll simply remove everything from here other than my to-do component. So now we get this. This is a bit ugly, and that's because of the default CSS Next.js brings us. So let's go ahead and delete all of them. And I'll just add a body zoom 175%. Great. So now we have our component ready for us. Now our to-do application needs a model, and we're going to create the task model for that. So I'm going to go to source, I'm going to create models, and in it I'm going to create a task.ts file. And this will represent a specific task. It will have an ID, a title, indication if it's completed or not, and created at, which will default to the current date. Now, I want to use this task as my entity, as my single source of truth for everything that's related to my application. So to do that, I'm going to add Remalt. So let's open a new terminal and install Remalt. Once installed, I can tell Remalt to treat this class as an entity. And I will ask it to allow all CRUD operations. Later I'll restrict that. I'll tell it that the ID field is a CUID, the title is a string, the completed is a boolean, and the created at is created at. So we have the entity defined with the Remalt decorators, and now we want to expose it as an API. So let's go ahead and configure the API using Next. So I'm going to head over to the app folder. I'm going to define an API folder, and in it I'm going to add a catch-all route for Remalt and the route.ts. I'll import Remalt Next and ask for Remalt Next app. I'll define an API with Remalt Next app, and on the entities array I'll register the task entity. Now since this is a standard API route for Next, we need to export get, put, post, delete. So let's do that. I'm going to do get, put, post, delete. Of course, export const. And post should be correctly spelled. Great. As soon as I do that, if I'll head over here and do /API/tasks, I'm going to get an empty array of tasks. And if I open some kind of client, I can go over here, get the empty array, and I can also post new tasks. Let's do that. I'm going to add a fix, and we can see that it generated the CUID and the created at was updated correctly. I'm going to add pay, run, eat, which I've already done, and I'm going to add buy. And once we've done all those, we can see here that we get the response when we go to API tasks. Now you may ask, where's the database? And since we haven't defined a database, we're using a very basic default JSON database that you can see over here. Later we'll use a more robust database, but for the start that's actually pretty good for us. So just by defining that entity, I got the database, I've got the API. Now let's go ahead and use it in our component. So I'm going to head over to our To-Do TSX, and I'm going to define a state for the tasks. And I'm going to use the same task type we used before. And let's put a count over here, or length, so we can see if we have any tasks. So obviously we don't have any tasks yet. Let's go and get the task from the backend. So to do that, I'm going to define a task repo with remult repo of task. And this will return a repository object that I can use to interact with this task. And the first thing I want to do is load the task. So I'm going to do use effect. And here I'm going to say task repo find then set tasks. And as soon as I do that, I'll get the tasks in the browser. Now let's design this a little bit. So let's add a main section and some kind of tasks map. Return a div with a key of task ID, and I'll put a span with the task title. So we see the tasks, and I'll add some kind of input checkbox that will look nice and will give us the checked experience. Great. Now, if you look at the network tab, we can see that these are simple REST API calls. It just goes to tasks and get the value. Now, by default, find goes and gets all the value, but I can control it. So I can say here limit 2, and it will get the top 2 rows. I can say page 2, and it will get the second page or the third page. And you can see these are just standard REST API calls. This noise is from Next, it's not me. I can say order by, created at descending or ascending. I can say where, completed true or false. All this from the front end, fully typed, making API calls to the backend. If I'll go ahead and make this a string, I'll get a compilation error because it's not the right type. And if I change it to undefined, it will actually not filter. So just by defining these decorators, a little bit of setup on the backend, and I have a fully typed query language to use on the front end that interacts with the backend with server-side paging, sorting, and filtering. Let's head over to our list and see what we've covered. This and that. Yes, I have a very thick pen over here. Great. The next thing I want to do is handle CRUD capabilities. So we want to be able to create, update, and delete. Let's start. So const new task title, set new task title. This is where we'll store the name of the new task. I'll add a form over here. In that form, I'll add an input with the value of new task title, with the placeholder of what needs to be done, and with an on change of set new task title e target value. Okay, so I have that. I'll add a button for the submit. and I'll say on submit add task, and ask it to generate a method for me, the function. So I have here the add task function. I'm going to need a form event from React. And I'm going to make it async and try catch error message. This is just standard code, and I'm also going to say to the event prevent default because we don't want the form to actually submit. And then we want to do a post call to the backend to insert the task. So we're going to say const new task, await task repo insert with the title of new task title. And once it's added, I'm going to say set tasks to tasks and the new task. And I need to do one more thing here. I need to say set new task title to blank because we want to blank it after we add. Let's see how that works out. I'm going to have go, do, read. All of these are standard post call to the backend, and we can see that they were also added to our database. Great. Let's complete the rest of the CRUD operations. So I'm going to go back to our to-do app. I'm going to add a few more functions. So async function set completed. It will get a task and a completed. And it's going to do const updated task equals await task repo save of the existing task and the new completed state. And then I'm going to set the tasks to task.map, and I'm going to replace the task with the updated task. And I'm going to add also async function delete task that will have a try, catch, alert, error message. And I'm going to say await task repo delete of task. And then I'm going to set the tasks to task.filter and ignore the task that we've just deleted. Great. Let's go ahead and add that to the UI. So I'm going to go to our checkbox and say on change set completed with the task and the e-target checked. Great. And I'm going to add a delete button and do on click delete task with task. Great. So now if I check tasks, we can see put calls being sent to the backend. And if we look at our database, we can see it actually updates in real time. And if we click delete, it will make a delete API call and also delete it from my database. So we've completed full server-side filtering, sorting, paging, query language, APIs, database. Let's spend a little time on CSS just to get this to look a little bit better. And if you don't enjoy watching me do CSS, just skip to the next chapter. So let's head over to our global CSS, where we're gonna define a background color of white smoke, get some kind of nice sense to it. I'm gonna make the title with a nice color of shade of gray, of red, font style italic, and font weight inherit. Cool. And I want to align it to the center. Next, I want to format the main section. I'm going to say that its background color is white. It has a border of 1 pixel, solid, light gray. Great. And I'm going to give it a border radius of 8 pixels. It will be rounded. And I'm going to give it a shadow of 2 pixels, 4 pixels, and 0, 25 pixel, 50 pixel, and this nice shade of gray. Whatever. Let's save it. So now we have a nice border around it. Let's continue styling just a little bit more. I'm going to say that everything under main should have a padding of 8 pixels, so it will be a little bit more spaced. I want to have a border, little line below it of 1 pixel, solid light gray. Great. And display flex, gap 8 pixels. Now I want the input and the span to take the entire screen, so I'm going to span, flex go 1, great, and then I'm going to do also that an input that is not type checkbox should also have flex go 1, great. And the last thing I'm going to do is input checked plus span. I want to have a text decoration of a line through. So now if I check a task, the span will get a line through it. Great, that's it, done with CSS. Let's go back to having fun. The next concern I want to talk about is validation. This is one of those concerns that gets spread around. You need front-end validation and back-end validation, and you can kind of lose yourself in your code. And I prefer it to be in my single source of truth. So the use case here is the user can add empty tasks and I want to prevent it. So let's go ahead and implement that. I'm going to head over to our single source of truth, our task, and I'm going to add a validation to the title. If the title length is less than 2, throw error too short. Title length is less than 2, throw error too short. And as soon as I do that and refresh the browser, if I'll try to add an empty task, I'll get a too short validation. But notice that there's no network call being made here. So this is front-end validation. Let's try to bypass that by sending a request that just has an empty title. And the same validation runs also on the API. So the same validation code validates my front end and my API. And it also returns a structured error object that you can use to put the right error next to the right field, the right input in your form. So that's pretty powerful. Now that we've done with validation, we're at the point where users like our application so much that they started giving it to other users. And user number 2 made a few changes, and user number 1 did not see those changes until he refreshed. And user number 1 wants to see these changes in real time. We need to use some kind of live query mechanism so every user will update the UI of every other user. So let me show you how easy it is with Remount. I'm going to head over to the To-Do TSX, and I'm going to say in the use effect, instead of using find, I'm going to use live query. Instead of using then, I'm going to use subscribe. And instead of set task, I'm going to get an info object and say info apply changes, and it will apply the changes to my tasks. Let's return the result. So now if I refresh the browser and have another user refresh the browser, and if I make changes with this user, the first user is going to see it. Now this is using an HTTP stream that is open over here, and we can see that every change that we make sends another message to that stream. This is great for Node.js, for development, for production with hundreds of users. But if you go serverless or go to tens of thousands of users, there are plugins that you can add here to make it more robust and bigger, and I'll demo those later in this video. So now that we've completed this functionality, our users came with another requirement. They want to have a button that will set them all as completed, and another button to set them all as uncompleted. Not a problem. Let's go ahead and head that. So I'm going to do async function set all completed with completed boolean. I'm going to do a for of task of await task repo find, and I'm going to do await task repo save task and completed. And I'm going to add 2 buttons. Set all completed with on click that will do set all completed true, and another one that will set it to false and set all uncompleted. Great. Let's see that it works. I'm going to hit set all completed and all are completed. I'm going to hit set all uncompleted and all are uncompleted. So I'm happy, my user is happy, but my boss not so much, because my boss looks at the network tab over here and sees so many network calls that it horrifies him. And he's probably right, because if we had 10,000 tasks, this wouldn't scale well. So let's go ahead and move this logic from the front end to the back end. And since we're using Remalt, that's actually pretty easy. So I'm going to head over and create a new class and call it tasks controller. Export class tasks controller, and you can place it anywhere. You don't have to place it just here. And I'm going to copy the function and paste it here, there. And I'm going to make it into a static method, and I'll decorate it with the backend method decorator. The backend method decorator tells Remalt that whenever you're about to call this code on the front end, don't run it on the front end, make an API call to the backend and run it over there. And now we only need to define the task repo. And just like before, when we used the repo on the front end, we made API calls to the backend. Now when we are running on the backend, the same repository object will make SQL calls to the SQL database, or JSON calls to the JSON database, or Mongo, or whatever. So the same way of writing, the same code style, can be used both on the front end and the back end, and can lead to code that in some cases should run on the front end and some cases run on the back end. Pretty scalable, a lot of fun can become out of that. Let's head over to the API and register this controller so it will have a route. Great. And in our component, instead of making this for loop, I'm going to call task controller set all completed and give it the completed indication. So let's refresh. And now if I click set all, there's a single API call that makes all the updates on the backend, and set uncompleted will set it back to uncompleted. So if you go back to our list over here with our big chunks of V's, we've done this, we've done this, we've done this, we've done this, we've done this. Let's start talking about the database. So far we've been using the JSON database and we had a lot of fun, but it's time to grow up and start using a real database, something like Postgres. So let's go ahead and add that. I'm going to install Postgres on the Postgres JavaScript client. And I'm going to head over to our API and say import from Remalt Postgres, create Postgres data provider. And I'll say the data provider should use a create Postgres data provider with a connection string that comes from the process env database URL. Now, since I'm using Next supports a local configuration file. So I can say over here .env.local, and that will not be sent to the server and will not be committed to Git. And here I'll say database URL, and I can paste my connection string, or in my case just type it. I have a very simple connection string. Yes, so let's save it. Let's head over to our API and save pretty much everything. Refresh the browser, and now we don't get any data because we don't have any data in our Postgres database. We can go ahead and add some data: buy, sell, eat, drink, sleep. And all of these are now stored in my Postgres database. The next thing we need to take care of is authentication and authorization. No app is complete without it. In our case, I want the task to only be visible for someone who is authenticated. And just like everything else, I want to set it in one place. I don't want to have this logic spread all across my code. So I'm going to head over to our task, and I'm going to say over here, allow authenticated. And as soon as I do that, a user that is not authenticated cannot see the data. Okay? They get a forbidden error. And I'm going to do the same also in my task controller because I don't want them to run the set all completed. So I'm going to say over here, allow authenticated. And that's it. That's what I need to do to protect myself. Now, of course, authentication is outside the scope of Remalt. But you can use any authentications that you want. You can use cookie session, you can use passport. In our case, we're going to use NextAuth. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to install NextAuth. And let's start configuring it. I'm actually going to start with the front end first. So I'm going to head over to our page TSX. And I'm going to make it client code, and I'm going to use here the session provider from NextAuth because I want to have session info in my code. And in our to-do, I'm going to add, let's see where we are. We have this, that, the other. Great. I'm going to add over here, const session, use session. And in our use effect, I'm going to say, well, if session.status is unauthenticated, then run sign in from NextAuth. Else, if session.status is authenticated, only then get data from our repo. And we'll need this to reevaluate whenever session changes. And we also want to say here at the bottom that if the session status is not authenticated, return a blank whatever. So as you can see on the right, this doesn't work. And as soon as we go to our site, it will try to go to sign in and doesn't work because we haven't configured NextAuth on our backend. Okay, and we can see that it should have the route API auth. So let's go ahead and implement that. I'm going to head over to our API and I'm going to add an auth folder. Under it, I'm going to add a NextAuth catch-all route and in it route TS. Next, I'm going to define const auth equal NextAuth, and it requires providers. After that, I need to export it with the correct method. So I'm going to do export auth as get and auth as post. And if we'll try again, we'll probably get a different error. We'll get a nice formatted error. That's because we haven't provided any providers. Now a provider can be a GitHub, Google, Facebook, anything you want, Auth0, whatever you like. In our case, I'm going to use credentials for the sake of simplicity. So I'm going to spell credentials right and import it from the providers. And each gets a credentials object and an authorize method that gets the credentials as parameters and return the user. In first case, we're going to return null. Let's save it and watch what happens. If we try to go to 3000, it will go to sign in with credentials, and if we sign in, it will send us that sign in as failed. It's because we return null over here. Now in our credentials, currently we don't have any value to it. Let's go ahead and ask them to give us a name. So I'm going to do a name here, and I'm going to add a placeholder, so it's going to say try Steve or Jane. Okay, so now if I refresh, we'll have this input over here. And let's go ahead and define a list of valid users. Now I'm going to use a static list over here. In real life, you're going to use a database or whatever. It's going to be of type user info from remalt. And I'm going to do 2 users. User number 1 is Jane. And user number 2 is Steve. And I'm going to add a function find user that gets a name and return a valid users dot find user name equals name. Now I'm not going to always get this name because I'm going to make it optional, and I'm going to call it over here. So our authorize operation will be to return the find user based on the credentials and the name field that we've defined over here and get here in the UI. Now this can be if you cannot find, we need to return null. So let's return null if we don't find anything. And next we need to do another important thing, which is set the next secret option. Okay, let me show you NextAuth configuration options. Okay, there's the NextAuth URL, which is important, and there's the NextAuth secret that encrypts the JWT and the tokens that are being used. So let's go ahead and set the NextAuth secret. We head over to our .env. I'll put it here, and we're going to go to some kind of UUID generator and put something really secret over here. once we're done with that, and we're going to go back to this article soon, let's take a look at our code. It looks fine. Let's try to sign in as Steve. And yeah, we do it now. And we are signed in. Refresh, it still remembers Steve is signed in, but we still don't get the task. And that's because NextAuth knows who the user is, but NextAuth didn't tell Remalt who the user is, and Remalt needs to know who the user is. So to do that, I'm going to export a function, async function, get user on server. And it's going to get the session from NextAuth. And it's going to return find user from session user name. So it's going to search the user by its name and return it. And the user can be null, so we need to say here or null because we don't care. Let's head back to get user or to the Remalt. And here we can configure that Remalt gets the user from get user on server. So once we do that, for every request, Remalt will ask NextAuth for the user. And if the user is authenticated, they can see the data, which I think is pretty cool. Let's go ahead and add some sign out functionality. So let's head over to our page, to our to-do component. Let's add a div over here with a span that says hello session data user name. Great, and a button of sign out, and on click sign out. Great. So now if we sign out, okay, we go to sign in again, and we can sign in as Jane, sign out, and sign in again as Steve. So we've defined who is allowed to see tasks. But there's a lot more to it. We can actually fine grade these permissions. For example, I can say that insert is only allowed to someone who's an admin. Now, as soon as I do that, Steve cannot add a new task. He will get a forbidden error. Let's go ahead and nominate Jane as an admin. So we're going to go here to the static list and say roles admin. And if I sign out and sign in as Jane, Jane will be able to add a new task. Okay. Now, if I sign out and sign in back as Steve, Steve still can't add a new task, which is kind of cool, but not good enough. Since Steve cannot add a task, I don't want him to see this section at all. And I want to reuse the same definitions that I have over here. I don't want to have two places to determine who can insert and who cannot. So to do that, let's start seeing what does NextAuth provides us on the front end. Let's check it out. I'm going to head over to our page TS6, to do TS6, and where we said hello username, let's do instead JSON stringify of user. So we can see that NextAuth only gave me the name. It didn't even give me the user ID. Let me sign out and sign in as Jane. And we can see that even for Jane, it didn't give me the roles, or the ID. So on the front end, we're not aware of that. And we need that on the front end. So we want the session object to also include that. And let me show you how we do that. We're going to head off to NextAuth, and we're going to play with the callbacks. We're going to say session. So whenever you ask for a session, please return the session, but on the user, place the find user of session user name. Okay, and as soon as I do that, if I refresh the browser, we can see that now we get the full user information here in the session and here on the UI. And what we're going to do with that information, we're going to let Remalt know who the user is. So we're going to head over here and say Remalt.user equal session data user as user info from Remalt. Okay, and now that Remalt is aware of the user, we can do cool things with it. We can say, hello, Remalt username, okay, which is kind of nice. But we can also restrict the form like this. Remember, we want to hide the form from Steve, who is not an admin. So I'm going to say over here, well, go to the task repo, metadata, and check if insert is allowed. And only if insert is allowed, display the form. So of course, Jane can see the form, but if I'll head over to Steve, Steve cannot see the form. And if I'll change this, if I'll remove this, so the role will be authenticated, and refresh the browser, Steve will be able to see the form. And if I'll uncomment this, Steve will not be able to see the form. So using the single source of truth, the task, we can control the API, the database, the validation, the authentication, the authorization in one place, preventing millions of errors. Okay, so now that we completed pretty much everything, I think we've done Postgres, authentication, authorization, it's time to talk about deployment. We want to deploy this application to the cloud, and I'm going to first start with Railway, which is a great Node.js cloud, and later we're going to play with serverless, so we're going to deploy to Vercel to demo that. So let's start with Railway. Railway have a great free tier and have a full Node.js server for you, so I'm going to say Railway init, and then I'm going to ask Railway to give me a name, and then I'm going to say Railway open, and it will bring me to the project dashboard. I'm going to add a service, and first I want to have a database, and then I'm going to add another service, which is an empty service. Let's head over to our empty service, and on our settings we want it to generate a domain for us. Okay, and let's copy that domain. And now we need to set some environment variables. So the first variables that we need to set is database URL. So Postgres will know how to connect to the database. And the second one we're going to take from here, from NextAuth option. So we need NextAuth URL. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to put the URL over here, and I'm going to copy NextAuth URL here. And the third one is NextAuth secret, which is kind of important. So I'm going to do that as well. And I'm going to generate a new UUID because we're in production and I don't want anything to leak. I'm going to copy it and place it over here. So once we have these three environment variables, we can go and say Railway.app. And Railway.app will basically upload the source code to Railway. And Railway will then run npm install, npm build, and npm start, which will run the next app properly. Now, while it's running, let's go ahead and discuss a few more things that I didn't get a chance to show you. So there's a lot more to Remalt to what we've seen over here. For example, you can reuse that single source of truth and generate a full GraphQL tree for it, or open API rules. So you can then reuse those APIs in your Flutter mobile application, or .NET, or Java, or whatever. There's a lot of places you can intervene with the code, like before or after saving or deleting, and a lot of places where you can control the data that it gets from the database and goes to the DTOs and front end, whatever. Of course, there's an entity relations. There's fields that are only updated on the backend, or even completely hidden from the front end, not even included in the API. You can have computed fields, and if you don't like decorators and classes, you can work without decorators and classes. And if you don't like TypeScript, you can work with JavaScript and JS docs. Let's head back and take a look at Railway and where do we stand. We see here in the deployment that it's still building, and we will wait for it to complete. And it is done. So now I can click here, and eventually our site is over here. We can sign in as Jane and add a new task. And we can open a second tab, place it over here, and once we check it, it checks on both. So that's it. That's how you deploy the application to a full server Node.js server, like Railway, Heroku, Render, Fly.io. There's many of those. Now, let's go ahead and consider deploying it to Vercel. So the first thing we need to know about Vercel is a serverless infrastructure. And when we use live query, we actually have messages transmitted from the server to the front end, and we need to store the live query state. There's a lot of things that cannot run on a serverless option. So before we go ahead and deploy to Vercel, let's disable the live query functionality. And later we'll come back to it and get it back to work using a third-party provider. But let's first of all disable it. So I'm going to head over to our Todo TSX. And here, instead of saying live query, I'm going to do find again. So it will do just a simple REST call. And then send the data to set tasks. So if I refresh it, this still works, but it doesn't refresh the data. Now let's head over to Vercel and deploy this app to Vercel. We can see the error over here because I don't need the return in this case. So let's take it out. And great. And now let's head over to Vercel and start deploying it to Vercel. So I'm going to open Vercel. And yeah, before I deploy to Vercel, we need to push it to GitHub. So let's go over here and say first commit. And let's publish it. We're going to call it Next. CRUD with auth. Okay, and I'm going to make it a public repository so you can later find it and take this code. And when it's done publishing to GitHub, I can say over here on Vercel, add a new project. And I can select the repositories that I created right now. So I'm going to import it. And I'm going to deploy it. Great. Now it's deployed, but it's not actually functioning because we haven't yet set a database for it. So let's go ahead and give it a database. So I'm going to head over to storage, and I'm going to create a Postgres database. I'm going to ask it to be Postgres and continue, and agree to the beta terms. And it will create a Postgres database for me. And as I connect to it, we can see here that it has all sorts of environment variable. Now, other servers use database URL for the Postgres, for the URL used by Postgres, this one. But Vercel decided to use Postgres URL here. So we need to adjust our code for that. Let's head over to our API. And we can see over here that we can use process env Postgres URL or the database URL. So if it doesn't find Postgres URL, it will fall back to database URL and continue working on my local machine and my server. The next thing I want to say over here is SSL, because Postgres requires SSL, but my local Postgres database doesn't support SSL. So I'm going to say that only be SSL if process env Postgres URL. Okay, so only, yeah, and I need to put it under configuration. So only when you run, when you have Postgres URL in your .env file, then use SSL with it. Also, you probably remember that I didn't set the NextAuth URL, and you don't need to set that on Vercel. Vercel helps you with that, but the NextAuth secret you do need to set. So let's go ahead and set that as well. I'm going to head over to our project in settings and environment variables, and I'm going to head over, put the NextAuth, and try to hijack a new UUID, place it over there. Cool. So now we have Postgres URL environment variable and NextAuth secret over here. And we'll say here update Postgres URL and send this to the server. And we can see on Vercel that the deployment will start shortly. And now that it's done, we can head over to our website. And hopefully everything works fine, and we'll get to sign in with Jane and add a new task. Great. So now we're deployed to Vercel, working with Postgres with Vercel, and all is great, but we miss the live query capabilities. We want to make a change in one browser and fix it on the other. Well, to do that, since Vercel doesn't have a server that actually runs, we need to use a third-party provider to handle the messaging for us. And to do that, we're going to use a cool provider called Ably. And this is the website. And I'm going to go and define a project here. So I'm going to go to the Ably dashboard and define the new app. I'm going to call it Vercel messaging, I don't know, or live query. Create app. And then it will provide me with a lot of docs and some API keys. Okay, so now let's go ahead and add this to our code. We're going to use Ably in our code. So I'm going to install Ably and start configuring our application to work in a serverless environment. Okay, so the first thing we need to do is determine a subscription server. We don't want to use the default one, we want to use Ably for that. So to do that, I'm going to import Ably from Ably promises, and I'm going to also import from Ably the Ably subscription server. And then I'm going to initialize it, hopefully correctly. I'm going to say here, new Ably subscription server gets a new Ably REST that needs an API key. So I'm going to do process env and give it Ably. Okay, and let's go ahead and define this key. So I'm going to go to .env and I'm going to put Ably over here, and I'm going to show the token and place it here. Don't worry about me, this project is going to be deleted as soon as the video is done, so you won't be able to reuse my key. But here we've set that. Now, since this is serverless, we also need to store the live query state. Okay, previously the Node.js server stored it, now we need to store it somewhere. So what we're going to do is we're going to take the existing data provider definition, make it a const, and use it here as a data provider, like before. And we're going to also say that the live query storage is going to be new data provider live query storage. That's going to get the data provider as a parameter. Okay, now where did you get it from? Remote.server. Perfect. So we've configured the subscription server to send messages using Ably, and that makes sense. But now we need to talk about how do we connect the browser to Ably. We don't want to give an API key to the browser because there's a risk besides that, and we also want to authenticate users who use our code. So we need to use some kind of handshake, and let me show you the process that I'm going to use. This is based on Ably best practices. This is a drawing from Ably website. This is our browser, and when our browser would like to register to get messages from Ably, it will first make a call to our server, the Next server, that will authenticate the user, make sure that the user is allowed to subscribe, and then send a request to Ably to provide it with a one-time token. That token will then be returned to the browser, and the browser will use that token to subscribe to Ably server to get messaging. Okay, so let's go ahead and implement that. We're going to need to implement some code in the front end that calls the backend, and some code in the backend to get a token. Okay, so let's start with the backend code to get the token. So we're going to head over to our, let's just put it here so we can see what we're doing. We're going to head over to our API folder, and we're going to get Ably token folder, and in it we're going to put Railway.app. And it's going to be fairly simple. We're going to import Ably from Ably promises and export async function post, and we're going to ask the token from await new Ably REST that gets our connection string, our key, sorry, from the environment variable, and then ask the auth to create a token with the following capabilities, which basically mean for any channel, allow them to subscribe. Now, in real life, this is where you'll authenticate your user, make sure that he's allowed to listen, decide which channels they're allowed to listen, and listen only on those channels. But here I'm just doing this to demonstrate how it works. And eventually I'm going to return next response.json of token. Great. So now we have this route, get Ably token, or /API/get Ably token. And let's configure the front end to complete this process. So we're going to head over to our to-do TS6, and we're going to add another use effect that we're actually going to need only once in the application. So I'm doing it here just because this is my entire application, but in real life I'll probably put it in one place. And I'm going to say is that Remalt API client subscription client is Ably subscription client of, and let's import Ably, and say of Ably or new Ably Realtime, and then the auth URL is going to be /API/get Ably token, which is going to be the route that I created a second ago. And the method should be post. Great. So now that we've defined that, once the component mounts, it will set the Ably subscription client, okay, and it will make a request to API get Ably token and get the token and send it to Ably. Now we also need to bring back our code to operate as live query. So instead of find, we're going to say live query. Instead of then, we're going to say subscribe, and the info will apply its changes to the tasks, and we'll also return it to unsubscribe when we're done. So after all of that, I'm really hopeful that it will all work. Let's go ahead and open our browser. Let's refresh it and see what goes on. We can see that it went to Ably to get to our server to get the token, and then to Ably to get the token from Ably. We can see the different calls. And let's open another browser and see if it works. Yay! It updates end to end. Now let's go ahead and bring this up to Vercel and see that it works in our fully fledged serverless environment. So I'm going to head over here, setting, environment variable, Ably, and actually I'm going to copy it because I'm too lazy. So I'm going to copy this and paste it here, and it will actually do that for me, which I think is kind of cool. And add Ably, push it to the server, and wait for Vercel to start a new build. And now we can go to our website, refresh it, open another browser, and see that it works end-to-end on serverless with Ably third party and everything else around it. So that's it. That's our long video on how to create a full stack CRUD application with Next. Just a little under an hour, we were able to create a full stack app with database, authentication, authorization, live query messaging, server-side sorting, filter, paging, validation, batch operations on the backend, and even deployed it to a Node.js server and to a serverless Vercel cloud. I invite you to visit Remalt.dev, where you'll see a lot more about Remalt and how it simplifies your life. You can see how there's tutorials here on completing every task, everything that we've done so far with React, Angular, Vue, or Next.js. Also, feel free to join our Discord, and we would love to touch base with you there. And don't forget to give us a star. We want to hit a higher number. Hope you enjoyed this. Let us know if you liked it. Cheers.